The term Agape love feast was used for certain religious meals among early Christians that seem to have been originally closely related to the Eucharist. In modern times, the love feast is used to refer to a Christian ritual meal distinct from the Eucharist. References to such communal meals are discerned in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 17 to 34, in St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Smyrnaeans, where the term agape is used, and in a letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan, in which he reported that the Christians, after having met on a stated day in the early morning to address a form of prayer to Christ as to a divinity, later in the day would reassemble to eat in common a harmless meal. Similar communal meals are attested also in the Apostolic Tradition, often attributed to Hippolytus of Rome, who does not use the term agape, and by Tertullian, who does. The connection between such substantial meals and the Eucharist had virtually ceased by the time of Cyprian, when the Eucharist was celebrated with fasting in the morning and the agape in the evening. The Synod of Ganga in 340 makes mention of them in relation to a heretic who had barred his followers from attending them. The Council of Laodicea of about 363–64 forbade the use of churches for celebrating the Agape love feast, though still mentioned in the Quinisext Council of 692. The agape fell into disuse soon after, except perhaps in Ethiopia. A form of meal referred to as agape feast or love feast was introduced among certain 18th-century Pietist groups, such as the Schwarzenau Brethren and the Moravian Church, and was adopted by Methodism. The name has been revived more recently among other groups, including Anglicans, as well as the American house church movement. Early Christianity. The earliest reference to a meal of the type referred to as agape is in Paul the Apostle's first epistle to the Corinthians, although the term can only be inferred vaguely from its prominence in 1 Cor 13. Many New Testament scholars hold that the Christians of Corinth met in the evening and had a common meal including sacramental action over bread and wine. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 20–34 indicates that the rite was associated with participation in a meal of a more general character. It apparently involved a full meal, with the participants bringing their own food but eating in a common room. Perhaps predictably enough, it could at times deteriorate into merely an occasion for eating and drinking, or for ostentatious displays by the wealthier members of the community, as happened in Corinth, drawing the criticisms of Paul. I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. No doubt there have to be differences among you to show which of you have God's approval. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat, for as you eat, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the Church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? Soon after the year 100, Ignatius of Antioch refers to the Agape love feast. In letter 97 to Trajan, Pliny the Younger perhaps indicates, in about 112, that such a meal was normally taken separately from the Eucharistic celebration. He speaks of the Christians separating after having offered prayer on the morning of a fixed day to Christ as God, and reassembling later for a common meal. The rescheduling of the agape meal was triggered by Corinthian selfishness and gluttony. Tertullian too seems to write of these meals, though what he describes is not quite clear. Clement of Alexandria distinguished so-called agape meals of luxurious character from the agape which the food that comes from Christ shows that we ought to partake of. Accusations of gross indecency were sometimes made against the form that these meals sometimes took. Referring to Clement of Alexandria, Stromata 3:2, Philip Schaff commented, "The early disappearance of the Christian agape may probably be attributed to the terrible abuse of the word here referred to, by the licentious Carpocratians. The genuine agape were of apostolic origin, but were often abused by hypocrites, even under the apostolic eye. In the Gallican Church, where survival a relic of these feasts of charity is seen in the Pain Be Acute Tenite, and in the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Nu Tau Iota Delta Omega Rho Omicron Neua Eulogii, also known as prosphra, distributed to non-communicants at the close of the Divine Liturgy, for the loaf out of which the lamb and other portions have been cut during the Liturgy of Preparation. Augustine of Hippo also objected to the continuance in his native North Africa of the custom of such meals, in which some indulged to the point of drunkenness, and he distinguished them from proper celebration of the Eucharist. Let us take the body of Christ in communion with those with whom we are forbidden to eat even the bread which sustains our bodies." Quote, he reports that even before the time of his stay in Milan, the custom had already been forbidden there. Canons 27 and 28 of the Council of Laodicea restricted the abuses of taking home part of the provisions and of holding the meals in churches. The Third Council of Carthage and the Second Council of Orleans reiterated the prohibition of feasting in churches, and the Trullan Council of 692 decreed that honey and milk were not to be offered on the altar, and that those who held love feasts in churches should be excommunicated. Medieval Georgia. In the medieval Georgian Orthodox Church, the term agape referred to a commemorative meal, a distribution of victuals offered to clergymen, the poor, or passers-by, accompanying the funeral service on the anniversary of the deceased. The permanent celebration of agape was assured by legacies and foundations. Protestant revivals of the practice. After the Protestant Reformation, there was a move amongst some groups of Christians to try to return to the practices of the New Testament Church. One such group was the Schwarzenau Brethren, who counted a love feast consisting of feet washing, the agape meal, and the Eucharist among their outward yet sacred ordinances. Another was the Moravians, led by Count Zinzendorf, who adopted a form consisting of the sharing of a simple meal, and then testimonies or a devotional address were given and letters from missionaries read. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, traveled to America in the company of the Moravians and greatly admired the faith and practice. After his conversion in 1738, he introduced the love feast to what became known as the Methodist movement. Due to the lack of ordained ministers within Methodism, the love feast took on a life of its own, as there were few opportunities to take communion. As such, the primitive Methodists celebrated the love feast before it gradually died out again in the 19th century as the revival grew. Contemporary. The Schwarzenau Brethren groups regularly practice agape feasts, which include feet washing, of supper and communion, with hymns and brief scriptural meditations interspersed throughout the worship service. The Creation Seventh-day Adventists partake of an agape feast as a part of the new moon observances, taking the form of a formal, all-natural meal held after the communion supper. The agape is a common feature used by the Catholic neo-catechumenal way, in which members of the way participate in light feast after the celebration of the Eucharist on certain occasions. A number of Eastern Orthodox Christian parishes will have an agape meal on Sundays and feast days following the Divine Liturgy, and especially at the conclusion of the Paschal Vigil.